These positions more or less describe the vast majority of the world's Christians in how they understand baptism. So now I'm going to give you some others who either object to what I've said so far, or they at least want to move what I've said so far in a distinctive direction. Ulrich Zwingli maintained that the material is incapable of conveying the spiritual, that there's a kind of dichotomy between matter and spirit. And I don't want to defend him on that score, because the incarnation becomes problematic. And his doctrine of incarnation is problematic. It's arguably Nestorian, actually. But that logic leads him and leads his part of the Swiss Reformation to treat material signs like baptism as merely symbolic, as stop-ahead signs that point to the spiritual, immaterial reality of one's salvation. So for a Zwinglian, when was I saved? I was saved when God accepted me. Maybe on profession of faith, so maybe I said the sinner's prayer and God answered it. And then later I got baptized. The baptism then becomes just a commemoration or a regulation that we observe because Jesus said to do it, but not in order to receive grace, just in order to point to God's grace. That's how a lot of your churches treat it, right? Your baptism, you ought to be baptized as, well, it's a good witnessing moment. It's a good witnessing opportunity for your friends and family to come and see you profess your faith and to see what happens when we profess our faith, which is that God accepts us. But you're not really any different after your baptism than you are before your baptism. That's a Zwinglian treatment of baptism. I think a lot of evangelicals have a much more apathetic attitude towards these things than Zwinglians did. I mean, Zwinglians call them ordinances. And ordinances aren't optional. You don't obey them if you want. You obey them because they are the orders of our King, Jesus Christ. And if I could try to articulate the baptismal theology of a lot of non-denominational independent churches in America, I'd say it's whatevs. You can be baptized or not. Don't get too wrapped up in it. If you're too wrapped up in it, you're not spiritual enough. But it might be a good thing to do someday. Am I overstating it? You won't see that attitude in the New Testament. You won't see it in the early church. You won't see it in the Middle Ages. You won't see it in the Reformation. You won't see it except beginning in a few 19th century spiritualist movements that treated material things with suspicion generally. If you've been treating this with some impatience, if you've kind of been like, who cares? Well, that's whatevs, right? That's a pretty popular evangelical theology of baptism. It just makes it hard to understand the New Testament, which doesn't share that attitude. A few other flavors of Christian stances on baptism. Baptists, now here I mean Anabaptists, I mean groups like Mennonites, Hutterites, and capital B Baptists in America. Discipline is pretty important in those traditions. And so the emphasis on discipleship becomes more pronounced in their theologies of baptism. Baptism isn't, the accent doesn't go on receiving saving grace so much as the accent goes on taking the way of the cross and entering into the life of discipleship. The Wesleyan position is broadly an Anglican position, like I said, describes the Methodist position. But Wesley's emphasis is on renewal and evangelism. Wesleyans were the most intentional evangelists and missionaries in England and in America. Working harder than the others to cross boundaries, class boundaries, economic boundaries, cultural boundaries, geographic boundaries. Wesleyans, therefore, have a more missional, evangelistic take on baptism. They're still sacramentalist, but whereas some of these other traditions would have, you'd spend a lot of time preparing for baptism, Wesleyans are a little more open in their hospitality to anybody who's ready to move now. Is baptism a way of manipulating God? Getting God to do what we want and what we demand? A word for that would be magic, right? That's what Gnostics are about. Gnostics are about gaining mastery of God's power. And if God allows that power to be used through baptism, then aren't we mastering God's grace and dispensing it to whom we want, like Simon the magician wanted? Well, it's not a manipulation of God, since God's desire is for all to come to Him. You don't baptize strangers surreptitiously. You don't baptize them in their sleep, because that's an inappropriate context. It's a context that's isolated from faith. However, we do take God up on God's orders, and God's orders are to make disciples with these practices. So a sacramentalist will say God has promised to work through them. The category of promise is critical for Lutherans, Calvinists, Catholics. We are taking God's up on His promise, with the same kind of assurance that you hear people say when they say, if you say the sinner's prayer, if you accept Jesus in your heart as Lord and Savior, if you believe that God raised Him from the dead, you'll be saved. And if you do those things in front of me, I will assure you of your salvation. Not because we've manipulated God into doing it, but because we're taking God up on His offer. And His offer is an open offer. That's not magical thinking. That's trust. That's faith. I think charismatics and Pentecostals, because they have a more they have a robust sense of God's miraculous work, but a mistrust of ritualism and a mistrust of treatments of salvation that are automatic. The Pentecostal position on this stuff will be, if you ask, it'll be articulated in Zwinglian terms, that it doesn't actually do stuff. But if you tell a story where God used your baptism, God saved you in baptism, it will be affirmed. Because I would say that in the Pentecostal way of thinking, God may work through them. You can't treat them as a guarantee, but God may do any number of things. God's kind of crazy, and we're kind of crazy, and so things aren't always predictable here on planet Earth. That's a pretty Pentecostal way of seeing things. What about infants? Is it appropriate to baptize infants? The Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist position is yes, it's appropriate to baptize infants. Basically because there is faith present. And because children belong in the covenant community of the church. Now, how is faith present? A Catholic will say the child's faith is present in the community's faith. Most of you are American citizens. You didn't become American citizens upon some gesture of allegiance. We figured you'd come into owning your Americanness sooner or later. The child's faith is nurtured and raised and even communicated and transmitted from his or her community. This is called associative faith. And if you want to Protestants typically reject this, but if you want a kind of biblical image to help you appreciate the logic, think of the book of Ruth. Let your God be my God. Let your people be my people. It's a way of saying, I don't know your God, but I know you know your God. And I want the God that you have to be mine. I know your people aren't my people, but I want your people to be my people. So through you, let yours become mine. That's a kind of act of appropriating an associated relationship. And Catholics will say that a growing child does that. Grows up in the sensibility, in the trust of not just the parents, but the whole church. Calvinists will specifically speak to the lineage, to the parents as the mediators of the faith of the child. So you are kind of custodians and trustees of the child's faith, which you grant them. After all, it's a covenant that's better than Abraham's, and Abraham's covenant included biological descendants. So why wouldn't Jesus's? Why would Jesus' covenant be inferior to Abraham's? And finally, the Lutheran position is baptism is the story that we are made right with God by no works of our own, but only through grace, which we received only in mere trust. And children live lives of trust. Infants are profoundly trusting. When you're feeding a baby, and you put the spoon in front of them with the little baby food, the baby doesn't go, there is no spoon. They're not skeptics. They live in profound trust of everything around them. And if God is around them through their family, through wherever, Jesus said, I want y'all to have childlike faith. It's adults who are a problem. So Luther said, how would you forbid baptism in a Christian family? Children are paragons of faith.